One of the great documents of mid-20th century aesthetics comes from the British writer George Orwell in 1946, just in the immediate aftermath of the World War, and in between his two great, probably most well-known works. Animal Farm came out the year before, and 1984 came out 2 years later. He comes out with an essay called Politics and the English Language. And it's a bit of a diatribe, wrapped in a diatribe against totalitarianism, among other things, wrapped in a style guide for writers. And he takes he accomplishes an awful lot in here. For one, he takes a shot at some of his contemporaries in the British literary scene and in academia, and writers who are suddenly trying to grapple with the meaning of what the world had just gone throughout the Second World War, and the rise of totalitarianism in general, both in its Nazi formulation and also as the evidence of Animal Farm suggests as well, the rising Soviet Union as well. The essay itself is, excuse me, very nuts and boltsy in terms of the what it's addressing. In terms of it is a style guide for writers, for specifically people who use the English language to convey meaning, and he interprets that at times very narrowly and at times very broadly. The specifics are often quite humorous, especially when he's taking personal shots, as he will do from time to time. But it's also very practical. It is a very clear-eyed perspective in an effort to get language to be truthful and accurate, and to clear away some of the illusions, some of the obfuscations that he sees so many writers practicing in those times, and in a time when, quite frankly, in the wake of the World War, in the wake of the London Blitz and the Holocaust and all the horrors of those years, he, on an aesthetic level, but also on just a clear-eyed historical level, is trying to assess what truth is. After a maddening few years, they're grappling with simple recognition of what the world is actually like, and trying to deal with that on whatever terms they can. He addresses this through language, through his medium of writing, and he has a little fun quoting different different writings from a number of scopes, from the British academic Harold Lasky through to Ecclesiastes, and he will have some fun with all of this. He keeps returning to a few core principles of clarity, however. Fairly early on, he writes, "A scrupulous writer, in every sentence that he writes, will ask himself at least 4 questions. Thus, what am I trying to say? What words will express it? What image or idiom will make it clearer? Is this image fresh enough to have an effect? And will he probably ask himself 2 more? Could I put it more shortly? Have I said anything that is unavoidably ugly? But you are not obliged to go to all this trouble." You notice there the emphasis on clarity with the caveat of beauty. He is a writer, and he is concerned about ugliness. He doesn't necessarily want an awkward phrase to seep in here or there. And what he is alluding to here is some of the clunky language that tends to come out in a lot of journalism and a lot of political writing specifically. He is concerned with largely political writing. Again, largely aimed at the rise of the Soviet Union. He's concerned particularly with communists, active communists throughout Britain and throughout the English-speaking world, who are generating a kind of language of totalitarianism as he sees it. This is an earlier precursor to, in 1984, the book 1984, when he goes on about newspeak and the concerns of propaganda and the way shaping language can shape perception. Throughout, however, he is addressing the role of language in history, and specifically in this moment. You see the phrase "in our time" repeated, where he is really emphasizing that this time is different, that in the immediate aftermath, again, this cannot be stressed enough, in the immediate aftermath of the World War, we need clarity, we need truth, we need, after being lied to and fed so many lies by so many different people, we need to understand what our world actually is. And if we are being fed lies and people are using language against us to instead of informing us through language, but rather to confuse us and filter facts through language, then that is just a recipe for more devastation. He takes particular shot at this in one paragraph. "In our time, political speech and writing are largely the defense of the indefensible. Things like the continuance of British rule in India, the Russian purges and deportations, the dropping of the atom bombs on Japan can indeed be defended, but only by arguments which are too brutal for most people to face and which do not square with the professed aims of political parties. Thus, political language has to consist largely of euphemism, question-begging, and sheer cloudy vagueness. Defenseless villages are bombarded from the air, the inhabitants driven out into the countryside, the cattle machine-gunned, the huts set on fire with incendiary bullets. This is called pacification. Millions of peasants are robbed of their farms and sent trudging along the roads with no more than they can carry. This is called transfer of population or rectification of frontiers. People are imprisoned for years without trial or shot in the back of the neck or sent to die of scurvy in Arctic lumber camps. This is called elimination of unreliable elements. Such phraseology is needed if one wants to name things without calling up mental pictures of them." So you see world events. These things all happened throughout the World War, throughout the Soviet Union, throughout, of course, ordinary politics as usual. World events get cleaned up, let's say, through language in the journalism of the day. People justify things. Well, that's unfortunate. It's unfortunate that, well, 1 million people were sent to die, or 6 million were absolutely snuffed out. It's unfortunate. We don't really want to dwell on that, however. Let's move along. Language can sanitize. He is saying, no, we need an accurate representation of reality through language. Language needs to be clear. It needs to be communicative. It needs to be truthful. He is stressing a realism of language that at that particular moment in history he sees, and he is not alone in this, he sees as particularly pressing. Without truth, where are you? And he doesn't get too deep. He dances around these politics. He dances around the horrors of authoritarianism that he sees rising up. He uses those as a kind of a context, but he brings it back to the immediacy of putting words on a page. He is ultimately a writer, and this is his document, suggesting that it is not necessarily his place to suggest how world events should happen, but that the minute action of just being truthful to yourself in writing might have perhaps a bit of a ripple effect, might have a bit of a filtering up into the upper ranks. If you pay attention to language, if you write carefully and you read carefully and you demand people write carefully for you, then perhaps those outer reaches of the context, those authoritarian forces who are so used to pumping out crap language that obfuscates more than it elucidates, maybe that will start to have an effect. Maybe he can change the dynamic. Maybe the world will get just a little bit better because you are more careful with your language. And so he ends his essay by boiling down all of his concerns to just a few simple writing tips. And they're pretty good writing tips. They're very conventional writing tips that you would hear in any writing workshop that you might take in a college or wherever. They're nothing particularly exceptional, and they are, in fact, in concert with many other stuff going on at the time. Strunk and White, for example, could say any one of these things. You break it down into 6. 1, never use a metaphor, simile, or other figure of speech which you are used to seeing in print. Well, that's fairly standard. Don't use cliches. Don't resort to the obvious. If people read something that they have seen a million times before, chances are it's not going to have much of an impact. They're not even going to really take it in terms of what you are using it for. They're just going to remember other times that they have seen it used, and they're just going to blandly, it's like, oh, okay, whatever. It's not going to have a communicative punch to it. It's not really going to land with the same force that an original image or metaphor or simile might. Number 2, never use a long one where a short one will do. How very British of him. No excess. No. Don't try and impress. Don't try and make it long Latin language your shield. Don't try and hide behind fancy words. Don't try and stretch things out to something that obscures the core truth of it. That is part and parcel with number 3. If it is possible to cut a word out, always cut it out. Less is more. Don't try and avoid too many adjectives or adverbs. Write with nouns and verbs. These are the things that get drilled into you in writing classes all the time. Number 4, one that is often overstated in my personal opinion, but what are you going to do? Never use a passive voice where you can use the active. Here you can read a couple of things. Yeah, that's an old standby of writing. Passive voice. Don't have things done to someone. Have that person do something, and that is more dynamic on the page, and it is. But also think about it in context. Think about the philosophical context of that instruction. He is talking about using language and writing tips as a way of being in the world. Never be passive when you can be active. Again, wake of World War II. Never just accept that, oh, okay, I guess the Fuhrer is the guy that we should follow now. Never be passive. Don't accept. Be active. Take responsibility for your own ideas. Number 5, never use a foreign phrase, a scientific word, or a jargon word if you can think of an everyday English equivalent. Again, very British. Never. It's the same thing as number 2. don't try and get too fancy. Don't try and hide behind language. A lot of people will use will use a word from a foreign language, perhaps, to just try and signal that, well, I'm fancy. I know foreign words. But why, and what are you trying to hide? Are you really making more of a show of the language and trying to flash that, communicate that, as opposed to what the word itself is meant to symbolize originally? What is the value of that? Why am I made better by knowing that you know the foreign word? Truth and accuracy and simplicity, not too much decoration. Strip the ornament and go for the core truth of something. And number 6, break any of these rules sooner than say anything outright barbarous. Again, so very British. Outright barbarous. How very, proper of him. Again, he is ultimately an artist. When push comes to shove, that is probably where he goes home. That is a prioritization of the aesthetic over the literal. He wants accuracy, he wants realism, he wants simplicity, but at the same time, outright barbarous. Well, everything within some bounds. There's something, again, so very British about that, so very polite and proper. And these rules do suggest, as I said, also the broader context. Always have a sense of proportion. Always have a sense of decency. Don't get caught up in the absolute rules. Trust your own inner instincts, your inner morals and ethics, more than just following rules, because rules can change. Grammar rules certainly can change, and rules about society can certainly change. But if you retain your own core sense of decency, then that's hard to really get rid of. Always judge the world through your sense of morality. This is, as I said, this essay, which is very short, comes out in between his two great works on totalitarianism, quite frankly, Animal Farm and 1984, and it is part and parcel with his project of looking at the world with a cold eye and seeing, all right, there are inherent powers that are very dangerous. And what can we do to defang them before they do more damage? It's a very individualistic project that he's engaged in here, but also a somewhat communal one, because he is calling on other people to do the same. All these individuals acting on a self-interested basis towards a greater good. The power structure radiating up into the outer reaches of the context, again, where an individual action can perhaps shape the broad outlines of authoritarian governments at the highest levels and prevent a return of the evils and atrocities that he had seen in the years immediately preceding and that he was following in the newspapers all too regularly as atrocities continue.